All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. We're excited to welcome new participants, as well as those of you who were unable to attend our conference in the past. We hope you were able to attend the sessions last week, but if you missed those or wish you could be at another breakout panel that's happening right now, that's no problem. The presentations are recorded and will be available on our conference website. I'm Michael Hoffmeister, and I'm happy you're here for this breakout presentation. What we cannot imagine cannot come into being, reflecting on a continuing process of anti-racist organizational change with Michele Mackey, Stephanie Munoz, Adam Jackson, and Amanda Martinez. On behalf of the Planning Committee for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, I ask that you join me in acknowledging that our University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, here on the shores of Wangshikomickla, or Lake Mendota, resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place they call Dejok, or Four Lakes. As the reach of the university extends to the far corners of our state, we also respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. Whether you are watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations, or you are more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land you are on. As social workers, we have a duty to look critically at the role our profession has played in the attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, such as was the aim of boarding schools in this state and across this continent. This conference is rooted in critical reflection on our work as social workers. Our goal is to bring clarity about the past, but also to challenge and inspire us all to move into action in our work in communities once the conference is over. We hope this conference provides space for critical reflection, humility, and openness, which will allow us all to reflect, to hear and tell truths, and move forward toward action and transformation to support Indigenous rights, cultural equity, and racial equity. With acknowledgement and gratitude, we move forward today in our journey. A few more details before we get started. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. We also know that many of you are curious about the CEUs you registered for. You're all set. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email. That's either because you were already logged into Zoom or because you provided them upon entering. This allows us to verify attendance. You will get CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email in the coming weeks. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted. We do have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenters. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we will not be able to get to all questions submitted. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters. Please join me in welcoming Michele, Stephanie, Adam, and Amanda. And with that, I'll pass it over to Amanda to begin the presentation.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for entering into this space with us on reflecting on anti-racist organizational change. My name is Amanda Martinez. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I'm currently a Master's of Social Work student interning at Kids Forward. And I will be the moderator for today's discussion. Before we begin, I want to remind you all that questions will be taken at the end. Today's discussion is an opportunity to discuss the importance of naming, healing, dismantling, and rebuilding from systematic racism. We will also invite participants to share their insights and strategies for moving white normative organizations towards anti-racism. We would like to be clear that if we will not be providing clear solutions, exact products, processes, or policies. Therefore, if you are hoping to leave today with an answer, this space is not likely to meet your needs. The panelists in our discussion today include Michele Mackey, Stephanie Munoz, and Adam Jackson. They will share their insights and reflections from driving an internal and external anti-racist agenda. We will begin by having each panelist introduce themselves now.
I'll go ahead. Buenos dias, Stephanie Munoz, she, hers, ella pronouns, and I am with Kids Forward. I work specifically with our Race to Equity project, and I also do work in immigration.
Great. Adam Jackson, he, him, his, L, and coach. My day job has me at a Fortune 50 company, but I also do a lot of work in consulting for nonprofits as board leadership for Kids Forward, for our Brown County United Way up here, and the Privilege Institute. Great to be here with everybody.
Hello, I'm Michele Mackey. I'm CEO of Kids Forward. I've been with the organization for coming on 6 years. I started on the board. Adam Jackson's our new board vice president, and then was COO, and now since 2021 am CEO. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm really looking forward to continuing this discussion that we started last year to share some of our lessons and some of our hopes and some of our dreams.
I want to give a big thank you to all the panelists for being here today, and we appreciate you sharing your insights and experiences with us in this discussion. Before we begin the discussion, it is important that we acknowledge how we are entering into the shared space. First, we are all currently living through a global pandemic, attempting to stay safe at home and also trying to work. Although many of us are physically positioned in our homes, not all of us are simply working from home. Many of our loved ones, clients, neighbors, and friends are currently working on the front lines of the pandemic. In addition to COVID-19, we have the distinct responsibility of learning our role in one of the greatest reckonings that occurred in 2020 surrounding race and racism. As many of you know, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the shooting of Jacob Blake, and countless other injustices against Black bodies and communities have sparked protests across the nation. This has motivated millions of individuals to vote for change. As well, it has drove a deep call for accountability and a revisioning for our country. In 2020, this reckoning has led many of us on a challenging and emotional journey of learning and unlearning. By placing our bodies on the front lines and learning to cope with the realities of our experience with race and racism. Those of us who have committed to racial justice and anti-racism remain engaged in the work. However, many individuals who have been awakened in 2020 have since disengaged within their advocacy efforts and their commitment to racial justice. Consequently, this is leading to deeper disparities and more aggressive attacks on BIPOC folks and communities in the social and political context. Now more than ever is the time for continued action. We will now be moving into our moderated discussion, and our first question for the panelists is, what is your short and sweet definition of anti-racism?
So for me, it is a daily, lifelong practice of actively countering racism in all of its manifestations. As a policy center, we're pretty used to working on it from a systemic space out in the community for policies and policy change. But what has been interesting for us, a growth space for us, is realizing that we also need to work on it at an organizational and interpersonal and a personally internal level.
Love that, Michele. And I would echo those sentiments. I often, when I think about a short, sweet definition for me, it is relying on the experts in this field, like Dr. Kendi, who has written, anti-racism is a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equity and are substantiated by racist ideas. Really easy, short sentence, really complex as you dive into it, want to think about it. But that's how I would kind of sum it up, and then encourage others to spend the time to reflect and read more and learn more and practice.
Thank you. I think similarly, I echo what Michele and Adam have said. We all know, I think at this point, that in short, it's the practice of actively identifying and opposing racism in policy, behavior, and belief. But as Adam and Michele have spoken to, for me, it's much deeper than that. I think of it, many see it as an academic perspective, right? Like, but for me, it's not like medicine, right? You're not a doctor of anti-racism that you get to go to work and, you know, operate on people and work through the practice, and then you're at home and you're a football coach or what have you. It is, for me, a complex relationship between the personal and the professional, and it's happening all the time. And it's a way of thinking and seeing the world.
And in considering you all have experiences in working with an anti-racist agenda, how does one prepare to do this type of work in a sustainable way?
I could start. And the first thing I'd say is there is no simple answer, right answer for everybody. My background is in athletics, and as a former Badger, I was really fortunate to work with the basketball team and the volleyball teams there. And what I took away from those experiences, and why I've kind of taken my practice in coaching into anti-racism work, is for me, learning about the fundamentals, not worrying about the end game. You have to know what your end game is, what the wins and losses are going to look like, but the fundamentals that we can each do individually every day to increase our knowledge, our skills, and practice, and in relationship with each other, is, I think, how you can build a sustainable way to do this individually and organizationally, as Michele was alluding to. It's something that, as I do my own self-reflection and my own work to, you know, try to decolonize my own formal education and my upbringing, and then how does that present itself as I have these conversations, or as I do the work in my workplace or out in the community. I think the other thing is becoming flexible and fluid and listening and telling stories, because stories are moving, they are powerful, and understanding how the data and the personal stories can connect to really move people and organizations to doing this work is what I've seen can be really powerful in transforming culture and getting commitments from leaders to continue their work and leading it for their organizations. And the last thing I would just say here is, don't expect to be the expert. There's nobody that is the doctor of anti-racism, the end all be all. I think anybody doing this work, we are learning from each other. We are leaning in to our discomfort when we are confronting things that maybe we thought we knew, but need to unlearn to relearn from an anti-racist lens standpoint.
Looks like Stephanie's waiting for me to go. So, there, I think there's what we've learned over the past few years of shifting a culture at Kids Forward is there are these internal pieces that I think really help you. One is really bringing a curious, questioning mind. Adam was speaking to this, so that you can not only see the reality of racism, those threads of racism that are toxic for our organizations and for our society, but you can imagine a different world. And so it's hard to imagine a different world, to Bell Hooks' quote, right, without bringing some sense of hope and some curiosity about what could be. So, and we have seen this really play out, I think, in our organization, that we have had to have tenacity and persistence around that core hope, right? I think that we're confronted in these spaces, whether you're a BIPOC space, whether a BIPOC organization, or what we mostly have in Wisconsin, which are white dominated organizations, with these infused norms. And as Adam was saying, confronting those infused norms in ourselves and in our organizations takes that kernel of hope and takes persistence and a tenacity about it. And then I think practically there are some things that you need. And one Adam also alluded to, which was power. And the top absolutely 100% has to be committed. And that's not just in theory, like you got the sign off, but in the day-to-day has to be in solidarity with this kind of a change. And then what I've learned in the past few years is, and you saw this with 2020, a lot of organizations very justly, very inclusively going out and hiring CEOs who are BIPOC. Plopping CEOs who are BIPOC in an organization that is infused with white norms is not going to produce a miracle, and there are no miracles to be produced. So you also need mid-level folks to also be committed, because those are the folks who are in the day-to-day. And I think you really see this in social work as well, right? Like you have your supervisor, and that's the person giving you your tasks, who's helping you with your clients, who is really setting the tone for how you work and whether or not you can bring an anti-racist orientation to that. So it is critical to also have the middle folks bought into that vision and driving that vision on the day-to-day. And then I think this is a space where last year we had a dedicated question for self-care, like how do you persist? How do you keep your kernel of hope going? And there's all kinds of stuff, right? And I think this discipline, I'm not a social worker by training or profession, but I lean on your profession to understand self-care because it's so baked into the way that you practice your work. So there's a lot that you could teach me, but what I have really leaned on, I think, my entire career and definitely in the past few years, is having your trusted friends and family, right? Having your peeps. And if you're lucky, you've got some of those folks in your workplace, or if you're even luckier, your boss or your supervisor's that one of those people for you, but often that's not the case. And so you really need those folks who share the hope with you, who know what's possible with you and can have your back and can have your soul in this work. We all know that it's hard on all of us because we're confronting these pieces, but it's particularly hard on BIPOC folks, right, in this work. And to have those friends and family around you who can hold up a mirror, who can support you and say, you're not crazy in that sense, and it's okay to be patient, and it's okay to push, and all of those things, I think is just critical in the self-care.
Thank you, guys. I will add that, yes, totally agree. In inquisitive mind, critical thinking skills, I think, as you problem solve, as you are bringing that ability to reimagine and to think creatively. I think this work also takes soft skills. I have found that as you're engaging with folks that are unlike you or that have a different perspective or worldview than you, the ability, which social workers are great at, to like talk to people, and communication and listening and reflection are critical pieces of this work. We've spoken to the fact that anti-racism is not something that you can, as of right now, go get like a degree in, right? There's not an area of study dedicated. I think that it's a growing body of research and academics, but I do think that there is some prep work in that regard, right? You can't just walk in blindly. There are folks that you need to look to, books to read, people to listen to that have experience and expertise. So there is some academic legwork, and I think that that is a continued process. The ability to know that this is ever evolving and being comfortable with that. I think some folks do really well in a place like science, where like, certain chemicals will always be certain chemicals, and that's not going to change. That's not the world of anti-racism. Things are evolving and changing. And as folks are bringing their creative minds and their lived experience, things are shifting. And so the ability to be comfortable in a world that is consistently evolving. I absolutely echo Michelle's sentiment that having your folks, having your people, whether that's in the workplace or outside of the workplace, also care for yourself. I think two key pieces for social workers in general and folks that are working in anti-racism, particularly folks of color in this work, a therapist or some sort of person that is non-biased that can support you as you work through this, and a mentor, whether that is somebody that is directly engaged in the work in some capacity, or somebody that has a brain for it that can call you and on your stuff and let you know when you are dead on and let you know when you're dead wrong. Particularly as a person of color that is constantly unlearning, I think sometimes I grapple with the is this my brain thinking about anti-racism? Is this me as a human with my own lived experience? Is this totally rooted in my acculturation and white supremacy culture? Is it all three, right? And so having folks that I can talk through that with and really delineate okay, what is what and where am I coming from with this? Those are all pieces. And honestly, some practicing, some failing, and some repeating is absolutely part of the preparation for sustainable anti-racist work.
Thank you all for sharing about the various ways you all prepare to do this work. Moving on into reflection, what have you all learned in the year of intentional work to becoming an anti-racist organization, including your successes and challenges that have risen?
And before we answer, I'll just pop in, this feels like an appropriate place for this question in the chat. I don't know if everyone else saw it, but one of the folks that is watching is asking if we can describe a white norm that we've been able to shift in the workplace. So we could maybe tie that in.
Okay. So I don't want to steal Stephanie's thunder. She's so active in our work of culture change at Kids Forward. I'll say a few things and then I'll pause and then we'll see if Stephanie says the other things that I probably would say. I think one of the biggest things for us is that we are hampered by the loss of BIPOC voice and a diverse perspective. When I joined, which was just around the time I think Stephanie joined, we were majority minority. And within that, we all had very diverse backgrounds and lived experience. And now I realized last night as I went to send our BIPOC staff information to do a racial equity analysis, that we are down to 3. It is just 3 of us and 2 of us are on this call. So I think that has been a challenge for us. We are addressing that challenge by having gotten one of the other things that you need to do this work, maybe not to start this work, but definitely to make this kind of change in organizations, which is money. You need to have a budget that is aligned for anti-racism. And after 3 to 4 years of a lot of hard work, we did that this past year for this year. And so we are diversifying. We are very committed, as one board member said, to hiring for anti-racism. So stay tuned on that. That's not quite a shifted thing yet for us, but we are working on it. I think one of the other things that, and this is a norm, is folks look at this work as a side project. I actually had one of our former funders tell me when I was getting a little help on, the structure of our budget in order to embed anti-racism in it, say, well, that's your special project. And so, you might have to go slower on that if you can't raise the money. And I was like, no, that's not what that means. What that means is this is this needs to be embedded in our organization. It needs to be treated as a core function, just like you would treat, we're going to advocate on health policy or something like that. And so, so I think shifting this norm that it is not a special project, it is the core of who you are, is something that we have definitely made progress on. And that is both BIPOC staff being able to do that, but also having a core of white allied staff and board members and leadership. And so, you know, I think one of the places that folks get tripped up is really thinking that you can bring in BIPOC or white allied staff and they can, you know, create a miracle, like I said. So it is having in all the systems this embedded, and giving folks the support that they need in order to make the changes, which is the other thing that I just want to highlight, because it is really hard to do and we didn't think we were going to be successful. We started talking to our funders. We started being very upfront about our transition to an anti-racist policy center, and they came through. They went beyond what we might ask for funding and gave us a little bit more. We wrote a grant in order to give BIPOC staff to value their contribution financially to this process. And we were holding our breath because it was a very traditional funder, and we did not, honestly, we're quite sure they were going to fund that. And so, but they did. And I think when you start adjusting those norms for yourself, for your team, for your organization, it has a ripple effect, because when you're doing that, it's really hard not to be honest to the rest of the world. And so here we've had this ripple effect into funder land, right? And now if they see that, or maybe they'll even tell their grantees in the future, oh, you know what, you're doing that kind of work, maybe you should value financially the contributions of your BIPOC staff. We will make sure that you have funding to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. All of those things, because luckily Michelle and I work side by side every day. I think for me, some of the pieces that I spoke to earlier about preparation for this work have been lessons learned in our year of intentional work. I think on top of that, I will add, which many of you probably know, it's not easy. It's absolutely deeply connected with every aspect of the work. Speaking to some of those norms within the workplace, how do you shift it? It has to do with how we schedule meetings, how we're holding those meetings, what are the agendas for those meetings, what are the hours of the workplace, how are we gathering, what are we talking about, who's invited, how are we deciding who's invited, who are we talking to, how are we making those decisions, how are folks being paid. So there's these big pieces that are interconnected. I think I've always known this, but it's been very much highlighted in the past year of intentional work that there is no straight path. I think we started believing like, we're just going to name it and we're going to get there and we're going to do the thing. And like, we felt like that tenacity, that audacious goal was like, we were just going to go. We had folks that were committed. We have folks on our team that are assertive and driven, and we were just gonna push forward. Everybody kind of agreed that we were leaning into it and doing it. We were lucky enough to not have a team where we had major naysayers, right? There are some organizations that stuff like this happens and people are like, I'm out, that's not what I came here to do. We were lucky that we didn't have that happen. Everyone on our team was like, yeah, let's do it. So we thought it was gonna be like this joyous task, right? We were on it and we were going and we were going to get it done, and we were going to be this place that is infused with anti-racism. But taking that step back and realizing that it is a winding road, and that there are setbacks, and that there are moments where you feel like you have launched much further ahead than you ever imagined possible, but something happens and you learn something new, or something in the world happens that impacts the work that you're doing. You have to commit. You also, it's really hard to be creative and to think about the ways. I really appreciated Adam's opening and thinking about its connection to sport, right? It's hard for people. It's scary for folks to think about the ways in which they have to reimagine their work. We have folks that have been with us for decades, and to think about and honoring the work that they have done, but helping them along and thinking about how do we shift that, right? Many of us know the quote, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And some of us feel like the work that we are doing isn't broke, right? We are successful. Kids Forward has been around for over 100 years. I think that means successful in the eyes of a lot of folks, but shifting, what does success mean? When I think about a white norm that we've been able to shift in our workspace, and I'll talk to that in particular, just because we're all at Kids Forward a little bit. I could think of a few things, but one thing in particular that I will focus in on is the way that we work, because many of you are probably experiencing this. Obviously, we know that the pandemic showed so many industries that being physically in an office isn't necessarily a critical function of the work. And so Kids Forward also came to that realization. I think we knew that a little bit before going in. Some of us were working remotely a portion of the time, or, some days, but we made the decision to switch fully to a remote first workplace, meaning that once all of this is over, hopefully it's over soon, we weren't going to go back to a regular 9-to-5 office culture, because we knew that the world was evolving. We knew that that wasn't equitable. We knew that that limited people's access to our space and to our work. And so we put together a team. It was voluntary, of folks that were interested in exploring how to design a remote first workplace culture. And in that space, we have talked about things like not having operating hours. We're not open 9-to-5, and it means we're being flexible. And we've had racial equity decisions on everything from what's the timeline for a response? If somebody sends an email, what's our cultural expectation around a response time? And how are we communicating with one another? And are we using the phone, or are we using email, or are we using this software? How frequently are we meeting in person? Are we requiring meetings in person? How are we communicating with one another? How are we making decisions? And it took, and we're still in the process, so we don't have answers to all of those pieces, but it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of deep thinking, and it takes people that are committed. We have a handful of folks that have said, yeah, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to take extra time. This is not in anyone's job title. No one's funded to do this work. It's not a deliverable for any of our grants. We're taking time to come together and talk through these things. And part of that involves healing from the past, healing from the impact that workspace and that workplace has had on some of us, being open to having those discussions with one another, and working to reimagine what the future looks like.
Find the mute button. I love being in community with Michele and Stephanie and Amanda. I have a whole pages of notes already of what I'd love to go deeper into, but I really appreciate the things that you were sharing, Stephanie, in terms of what are white norms. And I would just maybe speak from a board perspective, because that's the role I play for Kids Forward and in another organization. And I think when an organization says, I want to be anti-racist, or if a person says, I want to be anti-racist, you have to look and evaluate everything you do and reframe it. To Stephanie's point, how you communicate, how you think about things as simple as time or space or care for others. I'm calling from Green Bay, and so we have Lombardi time in Wisconsin, right? And that's how I was raised. Like I was 10, 15 or more early for practice every day, because that's what was ingrained in how I needed to show up. And I would joke about it at work now when someone's late for a meeting because we're coming from Zoom to Zoom to Zoom. They say, "Oh, I'm so sorry for being late," and I'm just like, time is a white construct. We can't worry about if we're 5 minutes late. If you had to take care of whatever you were doing, it's okay. And just reframing that. And I think as we think about board development or just even recruitment in this organization, it is, how was it done in the past, and how does it need to be done differently if we're going to be an anti-racist organization? Many nonprofits have the practice of, hey, let's look at everybody around the table, and you tell me 4 people that you think would be good on the board, and you tell me 4 people and then we'll go out and ask these 8 people or 10 people, whatever. And that's how the boards are historically formed, in my experience. And if the people in the room don't come with the anti-racist mindset, you're going to get exactly what you've gotten. And so really rethinking at those simple things, or I think they sound simple, but then as we work with the organization, I think it's, how do you challenge the leaders, challenge the organization to rethink everything they do, from fundraising to how they show up in the community, how the work that they're doing, the marketing, because as, even to go back to the question in the chat, like what's the white norm? Like the white norm would be, hey, we should worry about being an anti-racist organization because that might impact our fundraising. And if that's how an organization frames it up, that's a white norm. Like, oh, you're going to piss off people that are giving money? Well, who has money? If you think white people only have money, then sure, that's going to limit your ability if they don't buy into anti-racism. But that mindset itself is limiting and might be rooted in some internal racism or some internal bias in things that we don't even always have top of mind. I want to, if even the white norm question, I think as we think about anti-racism, and I don't want to assume everybody's at the same spot, but as I think about white norms, for me, it is not just white norms, but white Christian, heterosexual, ableist, patriarchal, hierarchical, and many more norms. So the intersectional ways that white norms, quote unquote, show up, if you're coming at it from an anti-racist standpoint, all of that's out the window. There are white norms and they're rooted in all these other things. So how do we really acknowledge and understand what white supremacist culture is, how that shows up in our organization, how that shows up in my daily life? And then as an anti-racist, someone striving to become and practice anti-racism, how do I push back against that? How do I challenge that in myself, in the organization, and be able to call those norms out? Because growing up in Wisconsin, like many of you, the norms that we are instilled in very early, from the communities of worship that we might have grown up to our formal education, to the workplaces that we now work in, like they're just ingrained in every aspect of our lives. And I think just acknowledging that, understanding that, so that when we come into those spaces, we can challenge it. That's the work that I enjoy and have passion around, to uplift the communities that we're all striving to kind of, as I think in the workplace, create a dope ass environment for everybody, and community for everybody. It's not I'm trying to center around one group of people, one person, but really, truly all.
I do want to share, as a student being in predominantly white spaces, that I really appreciate how Kids Forward focuses on racial equity and bringing in the voices of BIPOC individuals and communities. This is not really something I've experienced in past spaces, and this is also like the first time having a supervisor or someone that looks like me, and being able to share like my experiences with my family, having an immigrant background, and having like someone be able to understand those experiences. And then I have a question from the audience that says, Do you have suggestions for challenging organizational leadership beliefs that what they're doing is enough? I'm thinking about how we compensate bilingual, bicultural staff. They do make more than monolingual staff, but it is not equitable for the skills and labor we demand for them.
Yeah, I've seen like 2 questions around challenging leadership, and Adam may be the best person to answer this because I'm probably the worst. One, I will say that I have the privilege of being at Kids Forward. I have always had a good relationship with our leadership, and we, although obviously are an organization and have on paper a hierarchy of leadership, we have a board, we have a CEO, we have a leadership team, we have staff. That's not the culture of our workplace. I think Amanda could even speak to it as an intern, that we see each person in our organization as an expert in their role. And prior to that, I've always been a troublemaker. So I'm probably not the best model for answering this question.
Good trouble. Good trouble. That's what you've always caused, I'm sure. If you talk to anybody, any of my teachers, coaches, people that saw me as a youth, I was a troublemaker as well. And as I look back on it, I think for leaders, at least in business, is where I have most of my professional experiences. What I think is most powerful for leaders is getting them to commit to some things, whether it's their mission and the values. If they say, hey, I want to be, I value diversity, equity, inclusion, and hold them to it and point out the ways that we aren't living up to those values or missions. So sometimes just really getting tactical and understanding what the mission of the organization is in their words. And then the other part that I've found to be powerful, and I alluded to it, I think, in my earlier statements, but you have to be expert storytellers, because leaders in my profession, they can be data-driven, they can be mission-driven, they can be motivated by things from a capitalist, material, business aspect. Like, we need business outcomes is what they'll often come back to. Like, we don't have time to do this stuff on the side. Well, how do you show them this is how it is part of what they are doing? This isn't something off to the side. If they're trying to deliver health equity, for example, or they're trying to improve the customer experience, their customer base is diverse. So how do you share the stories of what that is? So using quantitative information, whether it's census information your organization has about its members or their customers, and matching that up with some of the qualitative things that we know and hear from our people, from the people, and matching those two things up. And when the stories tell the same story, data and people, then make it a call to action. What is that leader going to do with that? And what we often say is, before, you don't need to solve it. We want you to sit with it and listen to what is that story and that data telling you. Easy example that I would give is right now we're looking at the makeup of our organization from the front line all the way up to the executive. And in our survey results, our associate experience survey results that talk about, hey, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like everybody has an equal opportunity? Do I look at things like our special projects or things are given based on our performance and our contribution? And as we look at that data, that qualitative voice, we can see that our BIPOC associates score very differently. There is sometimes a 5, 10, 15-point gap between BIPOC associates and their white peers. And that's just stories around that. Then we look at how is the organization made up? And it is, as you would guess, BIPOC is actually the majority minority at the frontline level, at the entry level, and then it almost inverses one level up. So instead of 60-40 or 70-30, it goes 30-70 or 40-60, and then it just gets wider in gap and whiter in representation as you go up the chain. So when people say this over here, this is how we're operating, this is how we're set up, you can't deny what that story is telling us. So then how are we going to look at the policies? How are we going to look at the practices to really live out the mission and vision of what we're trying to achieve for our customers? Michelle?
Yeah, thank you very much. And there's a related question as well around paying for lived experience and the contributions of what might be BIPOC staff, but in some spaces wasn't the case in our on our team yet. But in some spaces, it could be white allied staff that are getting some form of value back for being a trainer in that space by bringing their lived experience, their knowledge and their skill in facilitating conversations, in driving the work. And so that is, combined with a story. And quite frankly, we're a really small team, and we had to, and we didn't have, financial metrics kind of folks to like really help us with it. But and I pinged Stephanie and a few of the other BIPOC staff, and I was like, okay, how do we value this, right? How do we value this additional labor that you are bringing and only you can bring to our space right now? And we actually have one white identified staff person who looks to be adding additional labor. And if that is the case, then that person would also fall in this group of, okay, this is above and beyond. And you are, in fact, where everybody else is sort of in training mode, you are in trainer mode, and we should value that as an organization. And the other thing is, it's not a salary increase. It is for the specific period of time that we are in our learning period, our training period, moving into strategic planning. And so it has been very much denoted as a project, a special project with special skills required. We're going to value those special skills as people bring them. And so, and it takes some work, it takes some definition, it takes some measuring and metrics. And I do think that, even leadership that is committed is also very busy. And so to Adam's point, it does help to be able to tell the story and to be persistent also, to tell the story and then tell the story and point out the instance. And, most leaders want their organizations to run well. They want to have that impact on the outside, whether it's products or services or whatever. And when they're seeing that there are these challenges to that, or they're losing people, or what's happening in a lot of organizations right now, everybody's getting on social media, right? And you see what's happening in Spotify. And they're like, oh, okay, maybe we need to do something, right? So I hope your leadership would see that quicker and start to make changes quicker. But I do have to say, it does take, repetition. Anti-racism is a practice of repetition, as Adam and Stephanie have both said.
Thank you all for sharing your insights upon leadership level, and we will move into now to the social work profession. So what does this all mean for social workers, especially in considering that white supremacy is at the root of the profession?
Thank you. Deep question. I'm a social worker by trade. And this is a good question, but it's one that for me is hard because of what Amanda touched on, right? The roots of our profession. When I think about the principles of the NASW, although more closely connected to social justice probably than other fields of work, I still see a lot of aspects of white supremacy culture rooted in that document in that code of ethics and that code of conduct. And so for me, the answer to this really touches on something on what Adam and Michele have spoken to in that previous question, right? For me, it means showing up. It means being committed, and it means challenging leaders. It means looking at your organization and the work that you are doing through a critical lens of anti-racism, and having the courage to speak up for your clients and to advocate for your clients. I think one thing in particular that can be challenging for me when I think about my work as a social worker, right, a case manager that was working directly with clients, was in some workplaces and in some places of the world, the perspective that I am this good Samaritan with a good soul that has decided to like give my life to charity and help poor disenfranchised people, right? Like that is how a lot of the world views people in this profession. That is how some people in this profession view their world. That's deeply problematic, and it's not at all our function. And I believe that social workers have the power to most deeply impact policy, which is why I do the work that I do. We have the unique skill set of working alongside folks. We are deeply trained in listening, and many of us have, you know, a lot of training in listening and reflecting, and a lot of us have compassion, and hopefully that's a root of the work for many folks. And so how do you take that and translate it to policy? I'll share a little bit of my journey. That's exactly why I'm in policy, right? I was working with folks every day that were doing everything they possibly could to shift their circumstances, and what they were bumping up against was systems, right? We're in Madison, and so affordable housing was not accessible. And so they had the job, they were showing up at the places that they had the credit, they had the security deposit, they had the good rent history. They had nowhere to go because there was not physical buildings that they could move into that they could afford. That's not a they problem. That's not an org problem. That's a system and a structure problem. And so when I continue to see situations like that, where it was like, what's happening here? There's nothing like that this person could possibly do, or that this group of people, or that the folks in this neighborhood could do, unless we are really fundamentally looking at these big systems and making changes there. And so I began to poke into the policy realm because I had access. I grew up here. I knew folks that were in government and that were well connected. And so I started asking those questions. How do we shift this? And how do we change this? And what do we do about that? And I started to see that more of my interest was in shifting those systems. And so for me, it was really, truly examining what was happening for my clients and thinking about what is happening outside of them in this one case, and what am I seeing, and how does that connect, and what are those spheres of influence, and how are they connected to the larger world? We're seeing this in Madison. Are there other models? Is there other places where this has been a challenge and they've addressed it? And who do I need to connect with to try to get there? Because I might be able to get this one client in an apartment, but that doesn't change the circumstance for the 10 clients after them that don't have access to affordable housing. And that can be scary as a social worker, because if the systems are perfect, we're not going to have jobs. And for me, that's okay. I think I looked at my job as a social worker in the perspective that I was consistently working to not have a job. I don't want to do this work. I think social workers have tremendous value, have had tremendous value, but how do we move our systems to a place where they are not necessary? And they are not needed at the capacity in which they are currently being utilized. And so I think it ties back to what we've said earlier in terms of the pieces that it takes to be prepared to do this work and to continue to do the work of anti-racism, which is that inquiry, that ability to reimagine, the courage to ask challenging questions and to challenge folks that have power and leadership. And I think it starts by, as social workers, really connecting with our folks, listening and understanding that regardless of our positionality with our clients have power, and they have voice and they have perspective that we never will as social workers. And so it's, again, not an easy solution. There's not a how-to guide, and the journey looks different for everyone, but I truly believe that the best social workers are deeply rooted in policy and in politics and are constantly looking to what's happening in local government, state government, federal government that can have an impact on their clients and working to make changes within those systems.
I'm going to offer a non-social work answer, but looking at it from a coach perspective. According to Zippia, I don't even know who Zippia is, but it's what came up when I Googled it. Social workers are 78% women. They are 67% Caucasian, 15% Black African American. And so as I think about anti-racist work, what I was going to share with you, and this might cause a little discomfort to some people, it might come as a shock to some, but the people that oftentimes have the most influence and can be the biggest barriers in anti-racism work is progressive white women. That is, you know, as you go through your formal education, as you earn degrees and you are becoming as close to experts or very knowledgeable in social work, as you come into it from an anti-racist standpoint, like I said earlier, how do you recheck everything that you've learned and come to it with a totally different lens? If you don't know what it's like for the clients that you serve in the systems that have historically marginalized Black and brown communities, you might have biases that are going to come up, and you might think it's not the system, it's this family that I'm working with, and they're not doing what they should be doing, or this child or this parent, and so as social workers, like, how do you not have the solution, but really try to listen? And then to Stephanie's point, really understand the systems that are impacting all those different dynamics that is impacting this family, this person, knowing that it is super complex. And you, as I talk to, I've been able to talk to CEOs and CFOs in business organizations who are extremely knowledgeable, that have awesome credentials in their formal education. And as they come in and they say, we want our organization to be anti-racist, it's almost like, how do you, they have to check all of that ego, all of that success that has gotten them to where they are. But if this is the path, if this is what they say they want to do, then they're going to need a lot of challenging and coaching and support to keep them in check in terms of you know, putting all of those successes behind and really reframing and using those talents and skills to in an anti-racist way.
So I want to hope that we have some time to hear from Amanda on this question, since she's been with us. And my answer is short, and I hope gives you a way forward to bring together both what Stephanie has said, her challenge, and Adam's amazing challenge. Because anti-racism, as I've said, is very much a practice. I'm a lawyer, a litigator, in fact, by training. And, you know, you can practice the law with checklists. There are whole domains of the law you can practice with checklists. You're not serving your client very well. You can probably practice social work with checklists. I mean, I know social work spaces that have their checklists, right? And those are very useful to sort of keep you on track. You're not practicing social work very well if you're solely reliant and clicking through your checklists. And just yesterday, I was asked, or told, in fact, that I need to start giving checklists to folks on anti-racism. And I'm like, oh, that hurts, because that's not how you practice anti-racism. I'm probably going to do it as an intermediary step, just like you learn from the checklist to make sure you get through all the things with your client. But that is not practicing anti-racism. But what is so beautiful, I think, about social work and radical social work in particular is that you are called to observe, to be in relationship with people, to listen. And as stuff is coming to the table, to name it with compassion and empathy, to work with it, to be there with somebody or be there within an organization and work with it. And I will tell you, right, Stephanie, and what little bit I've had the joy of being with Amanda are some of the most persistently patient personalities, I think, on our team. Obviously, as a litigator, I'm more the let's fight this thing. And so I think it just is something that you train yourselves to be if you aren't already that way. But that is such a great skill because as Stephanie's talked to, you have to just sort of keep at it, keep listening, keep naming, keep dismantling and rebuilding. And what is so awesome is that your purpose is to make things healthier, to take those toxic threads of whatever, and in this case, racism, and weave them with the person into something healthy. And so, I think you are in a practice that requires patience and understanding and empathy and persistent care. And so you have those foundations that I think Adam was speaking to at the very beginning. You have those building blocks, but then you have to decide and you have to choose to pull those building blocks together in a way that is counter-normative, right? Countercultural, radical, so that we can all be liberated in all of the things that we're after with anti-racism, right? So I just want to emphasize that this is my pitch to get into the macro side of social work. To Stephanie's point, this is a space. There are organizations, there is great opportunity, and you are needed because us policy folks, us advocates and lawyers and stuff definitely need you at the table as active participants in identifying and dismantling and then rebuilding something better. So we're very lucky to have Stephanie and Amanda. And I just hope that other organizations get lucky too.
I definitely want to hear from Amanda from this one as well, particularly as she parallels her experience learning the stuff while also functioning within our organization. But this came to me as Adam and Michelle were speaking, and I thought, and I reflected a little bit on the fact that we have such deep training as social workers on trauma-informed care, right? And the short of that is that when somebody comes to us, we, instead of thinking what's wrong with you, we think what has happened to you to have you respond this way. And I wonder what would happen if as social workers, we also, alongside that, thought about policy-informed care, right? And what policies, what structures have failed you to get you to this position that you're in right now. Because I think trauma is important, but that also, then you're dealing with the kid that is having behavioral issues and you think about the parent that, did something to them, right? That's still very micro-focused, very individual experience. And so I wonder what would happen if we started to think more deeply about what structures and policies have impacted that person's life. And Amanda, go ahead and take it away.
For me, entering the profession of social work, I did quickly realize that white supremacy is rooted within the profession. And although our classes, courses, trainings do address racism, racism remains within the systems we work in, such as the child welfare system, juvenile system, the justice system. And I think as social workers, we need to take our knowledge from the classroom into the real world at all levels of social work. So for direct practice, being able to understand the intersections of our clients' identities and acknowledge how racism, sexism, and heterosexism have all influenced and impacted their experiences. For me, I'm interested in macro social work and policy, which can be challenging work and it does take a lot of patience. But I think as social workers, we can use our privilege to work to dismantle those racist policies and practices. Since it is challenging, I do think even beginning within your own workplace, working to try to dismantle those practices. And overall, I just think it's important that we begin to elevate voices of color and begin to understand their needs. But yeah, overall, I would say that it is an ongoing process of learning and commitment, and it does take work, and we must be patient. And then we will move on into questions from the audience. So I have, how do you screen potential employees or board members to ensure they are aligned with anti-racism, especially in social work where it's the right ethics to have? How do we screen for white social workers who think they get it, but behaviorally enact white supremacy? I'm thinking about trying to make safe spaces for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and biracial voices, as well as trying to get those voices in the room so they are not just harmed once they're there.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to also tie in a question about reconciling for white staff because of the impact of BIPOC hiring. And as a policy organization that serves the state of Wisconsin, particularly for me, as I focus on racial equity policy in the state of Wisconsin, Wisconsin's a very white state, and it's hard to justify our work when we are way up north and the populations are not diverse, right? We're not a California, we're not a Texas, we're not a New York and Atlanta, et cetera. And so for me, when I think about hiring employees, bringing in board members, bringing in, for me, what it looks like is bringing partners into this work. I think about those things that we touched on earlier, right? I ideally, most of the time, am connected to and leaning in with folks of color. Sometimes that's not possible. And sometimes folks of color are not the best fit, right? Just because somebody has a certain degree of melanin in their skin does not make them the perfect candidate for anti-racism work. And so for me, I'm thinking about those skill sets. One, what have you done? Can you model it? Do you have any examples? Have you engaged in this work? Have you practiced in it in any way? And I have seen folks that do that on a volunteer basis, right, on their own, because I know that the areas of work for it are difficult. When you think about Wisconsin and this geography, there's not always spaces to actively have a job where you're doing it. But as we're talking, do you have models of what this has looked like for you, either in workspaces that are unrelated or in your personal life or in volunteer experiences? And in those models, do you have those pieces that we spoke to? Are you inquisitive? Are you creative? Do you have the ability to listen and to connect and to think, outside of the box and to bring courage and commitment to the work? I think about the goals. What are you doing this work for, right? What has brought you to this work and what is your intention as you do this work? We're lucky to live in a world where lots of people have good hearts and want to do good. And they, Amanda spoke to it in our opening in 2020 when, this was front page news every day and Netflix and whoever else was highlighting Black voices. That was all great, right? But are you doing it because you were called because you feel good about contributing to something? Or are you doing it because you understand deeply the true impacts on folks and you believe that you can contribute to the solution. So when I'm thinking about who I'm bringing into this work, I'm thinking about those goals. And I often have to speak to the impact on white folks as we focus on folks of color, right? I'm again lucky to work at an organization that is unapologetic about centering those people. I have been given the freedom to be unapologetic about it in my work as a human. As a woman of color, I'm unapologetic about it. But for me, it's really, and many of you may have heard, something along this line, but when we are thinking about our world as a whole, we cannot imagine that white people are living free when there are folks among us that are not. And so focusing on Black women who we know data tells us over and over again are most deeply impacted by our racist systems. When we can focus on making systems better for them, it's only going to have a ripple effect on everybody else. And I'll align that with, quite frankly, because of the privilege that I have, because of the work that I do and the way in which I'm able to do it, I don't spend too much time there. If I have to walk through that to get you to understand why I have to do this work, I don't know that I need you to come along on this journey. Because where I need to focus my energy is with the folks that understand the deep implications already and that believe that they have a contribution to the solution. And I think when we're thinking about organizational change, when we're thinking about community change, changes in society, that's really hard to decipher. And everyone is important, and we need everyone along to a certain degree, right? And every organization, I fundamentally believe that the janitor is just as important as the CEO. And so how are we approaching our work with giving everyone value, but also knowing how deeply we need to lean into some things? And some things in this work is making the hard decisions of like leaving that where it is, and you're going to come to your own decision on what role you play in that. And I'll be here on this journey while I'm doing it. And other folks takes deeper leaning into, and I think that's where that critical thinking, that conflict management comes in, like what making those strategic choices about how deeply you're leaning in to certain challenges in this work, because they will come up all the time.
So Stephanie is super passionate, as you can see, about this. You might wonder about her passion around this in the context of our organization. Stephanie is on the front of our hiring. I mentioned that we are building a team, and Stephanie is at the lead of that. I don't really see resumes and all that kind of thing. We deliberately structured it this way until further down in the process. I fully 100%, I mean, you could hear the expertise just exuding out of her. Trust the folks who are leading our hiring. And I think it is so important to have that, right? When you have that kind of passion, when you give staff, if you are, ultimately making decisions around hiring, when you give staff that amount of power, and you trust their insight, and you listen to them, and they are all very knowledgeable. The folks on the mini team on our hiring are all very knowledgeable. They are very committed to where we're going. They are practicing it themselves on the daily, internally and externally, driving various initiatives. They can figure out who is at a place to contribute. I think there are we're very small, and so we definitely need the folks who can come in and understand anti-racism. And we don't have the means to train up folks in that way, but a lot of folks who are in bigger organizations, Adam's a part of a big organization, and you can and should, if you are part of a bigger organization, lean into the spectrum, right? Be able to bring people on board and have things set up, like have a DEI person or have resources and trainings and all of those things set up for people. Because if you do have that interest, if you now in 2022 are still sustaining your interest from 2020, and you do want to find a place that is forward thinking and concerned about the future of all peoples, right? And are trying to be anti-racist, then you want to invite those folks into your space, right? But you're going to have to support them. And I think on the piece around the concern around and lived experience of white staff being worried, I think in a lot of our organizations here in Wisconsin, because of the demographics, because of the history, you tend to have this, what Adam was describing, where it's BIPOC staff in the entry level, and it is white identified staff in the higher echelons, right? And I think you have to be honest, and you have to start having conversation in your organization about how that came to be. And if you are going to be anti-racist, how that cannot persist. It absolutely 100% cannot persist. And all the reasons that are given, you're going to have to start tackling them and bringing them down and being honest about them. And so there are some really practical things that you can do where it's also related to the wage stuff. We are doing, I've gotten the budget to do an equity analysis of our compensation. As first stages of that, the leadership team at Kids Forward has looked at where folks are at. We've defined sort of like different levels. We've started to like identify what skills and knowledge you need for those different levels. If you're in a bigger bureaucracy, that's set for you, which means that now you have the challenge of not creating yet, but of starting to look at how that was set. Why is that set that way? Is that criteria that's sitting there under being a senior or being higher up beyond entry level, is that really reflective of what the job is? Or is that just a norm that has been created and sustained? And so I think, if you're moving to a culture of anti-racism, the more you're talking about it, the more you have white identified folks thinking about it in terms of meetings or thinking about it in terms of this process or that process. Once you start to say, look, we're going to have to bring folks in at all the levels, then you have something to say to them because they've already started on the road of thinking what anti-racism is. And then you get to say, okay, we have all white staff in these levels. We know now how that has happened and perpetuated. It is our responsibility to do something about that. And ultimately, this is where the power conversation, right? Ultimately, you need to have a source of power in the organization that if, even with people hearing that, they can't do the right thing, right? And be okay with BIPOC staff elevating, then you need the power to say that is who we are going to be. That is who we are, and to institute it.
Love that, Michele and Stephanie. I, from a hiring perspective, I also think about if your vision and your mission and you're really clear, this is what is important to us, it will screen some people out. It might screen out some current people, and that's okay. That everybody's going to find a place where they can thrive, and if this isn't it, then that's okay. I think so. Having visibility around what's important. I'll use a different nonprofit that I was in leadership role. I supported and co-wrote a piece around our vision forward for the Brown County United Way. And it was really clear why we were doing it and what that future forward thinking is looking like. And so instead of just having the CEO craft and put it out there, I think having alignment and support with other leaders that support that organization is really important. And then donors or people that are prospective new employees, they should read that. And that comes up in the interview. How are you going to support this as a board member? What does this mean to you as a future staff member? And I love how Stephanie was saying, there may not be something on the resume, but you can identify the skills and their experience and what, if they have practiced, even if it's very early on in an anti-racist journey. Are they willing to be uncomfortable? Are they willing to listen, have empathy? What other skills and practice are they going to need? As an employer now, one of my favorite questions to ask as we do our anti-racist work is, are you willing to put your job on the line every day? Because in a white, and I'm going to switch because many times people hear predominantly white institutions, organizations, schools. I like to add the word historically white, historically predominantly white. And if you're coming in an organization that is historically predominantly white, in the leadership, in the makeup of that organization and the services you provide, are you willing to put your job on the line? Because if you're going to be an anti-racist, you're going to be pushing against everything that has made that organization what it is. And if people aren't okay with that, whether they're, no matter their racial background, their gender, if it's white people, I would love that. And some of my dearest friends and allies and co-conspirators in my workplace are the white people that get it and understand they can say things and do things that I can't, or my Black women colleagues, or my Hispanic men colleagues. Like, we can't say some things that they can say because the ATM for them just replenishes it. So we want to say, spend it, even if it's putting your job on the line. Are you willing to do that for cause of anti-racism? And I think all of us just have to think about that in the places that we work to, if your practices have generated historically predominantly white organizations, social work organizations, what are the practices that need to be dismantled, demolished, and maybe rebuilt so that they have a different lens and a different process and practices and policies that will lead to an equitable work staff that's going to serve the community.
This has been a very great discussion, and as our time here comes to an end, are there any last words, remarks, or recommendations that you all give for being an anti-racist organization?
So there is, I'm going to tie in my answer with a question in the chat, and I apologize that we can't, get to all the questions because these are great questions. But there was a question about books on these topics, and there are a ton of books. If you Google anti-racism, right, like you're gonna get a whole lot of stuff. But I'm actually going to pitch for a book that is, I think the author's controversial. And I just assigned our team the book to read. I gave BIPOC staff a little more time with the book because it's not written for BIPOC folks. It's written for, to Adam's point, white identified progressives. And that is the new book from Robin DiAngelo, Nice Racism. And given the statistics that Adam mentioned about the social work profession, I think it is a very valuable book. It takes time, right? It takes, give yourself some time to get through the chapters and take a break maybe and come back. And I gave BIPOC staff a little more time in terms of like when they need to come to the table, having read the book, because it can be challenging, and Robin DiAngelo says that in the beginning, because what is happening is she is describing our experience, right? And so I recommend that book, especially if you are a UW-Madison person, or if you are in Dade County, or our beautiful progressive Madison environment. And so just to start thinking about how Midwest nice, although very awesome. I mean, I enjoy it every day, but it is not anti-racist. And so let's think about how we are kind and open and polite with each other and compassionate, but at the same time anti-racist.
All right. Maybe I'll I don't know, might not be able to see it. The book is Me and White Supremacy. Fat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor. Again, this is not for the light of heart. It's a way that you can start your journey, continue your journey, but it's not that big. I mean, it's a small book in stature, but 230 pages, but it is packed with work for everybody. And as my good friend Eddie says, everybody has work to do in this space. It doesn't matter who we are. If you're going to be anti-racist, even someone that's tried to practice it, try to become it over years or decades, or just starting, we all have work to do. So continue to do this would be really important. And then I'm going to go back to how Michele opened up the session in terms of self-care. This isn't for the faint of heart. So you have to find the ways that you can take care of yourself, especially BIPOC folks. And what I give a short little workshop at my workplace about is rituals, routines, and relationships. How are those things embedded in your radical self-care so that you are regularly doing it, or you're at least having rituals that will fill your soul? And that could be going to play 18 holes, it could be going to a spa, it could be whatever fills your soul in ritual ways and in daily routines. And then people, like you might need to unfriend some people, you might need to open up your friendship circles, but how can you do this work in relationship with each other, who can hold you accountable, who can uplift you when the stuff gets really hard? Those relationships are gonna be what kind of keeps you on firm ground, keeps you sane and accountable to continue to do this work. Thanks, everybody.
Gracias, y'all. Gracias for being here, for spending time with us, for choosing to come and listen to us speak when you had so many wonderful choices. Yeah, I mean, Google is a beautiful tool. I think depending on where you are and where you land on the spectrum, you know, there are a variety of resources. All I will say is center BIPOC folks, right? In every way possible as you are learning, as you are exploring, as you are unlearning, as you think about your everyday aspects, right? I think about Amanda has a task of being up to date with the news, right? Who's telling you your news? Is it from the perspective of white folks, or is it folks of color? How are you just learning more about the world outside of what you're used to? And I think that really gets to working that muscle and that piece of inquiry, right, and reimagining. So thank you all. It's a long journey. You all play a role in it. And I hope that you guys all got something valuable from our time today.
Thank you to Stephanie, Michele, and Adam for sharing your experiences and all your great insight. I also want to give a big thank you to the audience for attending our discussion, and we hope that you enjoy the closing session of this conference. Thank you all.
Many thanks to Michele, Stephanie, Adam, and Amanda for sharing their time, expertise, and valuable information with us today. And thank you to everyone in attendance for being part of this event and for your commitment and efforts to confront racial justice. Before you leave today, please fill out the evaluation form. We put a link to the evaluation in the Q&A section. And if you don't have time to fill that out now, you can also watch for an email coming later today with a link to complete the evaluation later. And again, for those of you who requested CEUs when registering, you will receive those in your email. Also, please be sure to join us at 2 p.m. For our closing session of the conference. We hope you can make that. The link to that is also in the Q&A section. Thank you all. Hope you have a great rest of your day.